There is a kind of tiredness that doesn't come from doing too much. It comes from watching, monitoring, checking, measuring the distance between where things are and where you need them to be. It arrives quietly, not as exhaustion exactly, but as a tightness somewhere behind the eyes, a low hum of vigilance that never quite stops. Most people have lived with it so long they no longer notice it as something separate from themselves. They just call it being responsible, being careful, being someone who takes things seriously. Before we go any further, take a moment right now to notice whether that particular tightness is present in you. Not to fix it, just to see whether it's there. The strange thing about this kind of mental grip is that it doesn't feel like fear. It feels like effort, like diligence, like the reasonable thing a person does when life has shown them, at some point, that things can go wrong. And so the mind makes a quiet agreement with itself. If I stay alert enough, if I anticipate enough, if I keep enough variables in view, then maybe the worst won't happen. And yet, the people who hold most tightly to that agreement are often the ones who feel least at peace. Not because they are doing something wrong, but because the agreement itself rests on a misunderstanding about what control actually is and what it is actually trying to protect. Here is what that misunderstanding costs. There is something worth seeing clearly before we go any further. Life has not been waiting for you to relax before it moves. It has been moving this entire time. The heart beats without being asked. The breath returns without a decision. Seasons arrive and complete themselves without a single consultation with the mind that is busy managing everything else. This is not a metaphor. It is what is actually happening right now underneath all the monitoring. The grip does not stop this. It never could. What the grip stops is something quieter, the ability to see that the movement was already there, the ability to rest in something that does not require your management in order to continue. That is what has been lost, not the flowing, the seeing of it. There is something the Buddha pointed to repeatedly in the old teachings, something almost embarrassingly simple once you see it. He didn't say, "The problem is that life is uncertain." He said, "The problem is what the mind does with uncertainty." Not the uncertainty itself, the reaching, the grasping, the insistence that certainty can be manufactured if you think hard enough, plan carefully enough, worry thoroughly enough. And somewhere in that insistence, not in the difficulty of life, but in the mind's refusal to let difficulty simply be what it is, suffering begins. There is something here that most teachings stop just short of saying. Not that you should try less hard. Not that you should care less. But that the very act of gripping, the specific mental motion of trying to hold the world in place, is itself the source of the weight you are carrying. The grip is not keeping anything safe, and it is not blocking the movement of life. Life does not need your permission to continue. What it is blocking is simpler and more personal than that. It is blocking the view. It is the thing that keeps the mind too busy constructing futures to notice what is already, quietly, completely here. Someone is sitting at a kitchen table early in the morning. The house is still. The light is that particular gray-blue color before the day decides what kind of day it will be. There is coffee, there is quiet. On the surface, nothing is wrong. And yet the mind is already several hours ahead. Running through a conversation that hasn't happened yet, rehearsing the right words, anticipating the wrong response, preparing a backup, then a backup for the backup. The body is in that kitchen. The breath is happening unnoticed, slow and steady. The coffee is getting cold. But none of that is where the person is. They are somewhere in the future, in a version of events that may never occur, managing a problem that exists only because the mind created it and then forgot that it did. This is not a failure of character. It is not weakness or anxiety in the clinical sense. It is what the Pali texts call sankhara, the habitual formations of mind that keep assembling experience into stories about what might happen, what could go wrong, what needs to be prevented. The mind doesn't do this to cause suffering. It does this because at some point it learned that prediction was protection. And it never quite got the news that the cost of constant prediction is the present moment itself. Notice, if you're willing, whether some part of your mind is doing this right now. Not in a critical way, just noticing. Is there a conversation somewhere in the background? A situation being quietly rehearsed? A worst case being held just in case? The Buddha once encountered a Brahmin named Danya who had spent years securing everything around him. His cattle penned, his hut finished, his rice harvested, his fires lit. He was proud of what he had prepared for. And the Buddha's response, as it appears in the early texts, was not to praise the preparation or to criticize it. It was simply to point at something Danya had not prepared for and could not prepare for, the movement of his own mind. Not the storms outside, the turbulence inside. Because that is where the real vulnerability lives, not in the unpredictability of external events, but in the mind's relationship to that unpredictability. Two people can face the same uncertainty. One collapses under it. One moves through it cleanly, even lightly. The difference is rarely circumstances. It is whether the mind treats uncertainty as a problem requiring solution, or as the simple texture of being alive. There is a moment, and if you have ever experienced it, you know it precisely, when the grip loosens without you deciding to loosen it. Not because something got resolved, not because the situation improved, but because the mind, for reasons it cannot fully explain, stopped fighting the shape of things. Maybe it happened during an illness when there was nothing left to plan. Maybe it came at the end of a long struggle with someone you loved, when the argument finally ran out of energy. Maybe it arrived in a moment of grief so complete that resistance became impossible. Whatever the circumstance, the loosening felt the same. Not like giving up, not like defeat. Like the air-changing pressure. A release that revealed something had been held so long it had become invisible. And in that moment, something the mind had been searching for through all its monitoring and anticipating, something it thought it would find by getting things right, was simply already there. Quiet still, not dependent on how anything turned out. The Theravada tradition has a word for this quality of mind, upekkha, often translated as equanimity but not passivity, not indifference, not the flatness of someone who has stopped caring. More like the quality of a clear sky, which is not unaffected by weather, but is also not defined by it. Clouds move through, the sky remains sky. This is not a metaphor for checking out. It is a description of what becomes possible when the mind stops treating every incoming event as a referendum on whether things are okay. If something in this is landing in a real place, if there is a specific knot of tension you recognize in what's been described, notice whether part of you is already trying to figure out how to fix it. That noticing itself is the beginning of something. Here is what makes this teaching difficult to hear, without immediately misusing it. The mind, upon learning that control is the problem, immediately wants to control the controlling. It says, okay, I need to stop gripping so hard. I need to practice letting go. I need to become the kind of person who doesn't do this. And in that very response, the grip has simply moved one level deeper. The Pali concept here is upadana, usually translated as clinging or attachment. But the Buddha's teaching on upadana was not primarily about the objects we cling to. It was about the act of claiming. The motion of the mind that says, this experience, this outcome, this person, this feeling, this is mine. This belongs to me. This is what makes me safe or happy or whole. Upadana is not love. It is not care. It is not responsibility. It is the specific motion of trying to turn something impermanent into a foundation. And the reason it generates suffering is not that the things we cling to are bad. It is that they are already moving. They were always moving. Holding them still is not a skill. It is not something that can be learned with more effort. What can be learned, what the teachings point toward, is seeing clearly enough that the reaching simply doesn't start. Not because you stopped yourself, but because you saw, directly and without argument, that there was nothing solid to reach for, and so the hand didn't extend. This is what the Buddha meant when he said in the Bahya Sutta that in the seen there is just the seen, in the heard just the heard, in the known just the known. Not a technique for staying calm. A description of what perception actually is when the mind is not adding a layer of story about what the perception means for the safety of a self. Here is something small you can try. Not as a practice, not as homework, just as a curiosity for the next few hours. When you notice the mind moving toward a future scenario, a rehearsal, a worry, a plan, don't try to stop it. Just notice, is there something happening right now in the actual present that prompted that movement? Or is the future scenario the only thing that's real in this moment? Not a judgment, just an honest look. Is there a body here breathing? Is there a room? Is there a texture to the air, a sound somewhere? The mind that has just seen the difference between what is present and what is constructed doesn't need to be told to relax. It simply settles, because it has returned to something it can actually be in. There is a quality that runs through the lives of people who seem, at some point, to have made peace with uncertainty. Not that they have no fear, not that nothing goes wrong, but that their relationship to not knowing has changed. They no longer experience uncertainty as a failure of preparation. They don't treat delay as punishment. They don't read difficulty as evidence that something is fundamentally broken. They have, somewhere along the way, noticed something the mind tends to miss when it is busy protecting itself. That most of what arrives in a life, the unexpected redirections, the losses that turned out to be doorways, the long waits that shaped something essential, none of it was controlled into being. It came from the part of life that was moving while you were watching something else. And it often brought exactly what the controlled parts never could. The image that keeps returning in the old Pali texts is water. Not the dramatic water of rivers in flood, the ordinary movement of water through a landscape. Water does not fight the shape of the ground. It doesn't resist rock. It finds its way around, over, under, not because it has decided to be strategic, but because that is simply what water does when nothing is forcing it. The person who has stopped gripping doesn't become passive. They become, in some strange way, more effective, because their energy is no longer being consumed by the resistance. They act, they care, they show up fully. They simply don't spend the space between actions in a state of managed emergency. Before you move on from this, if something here touched something real in your experience, even a small recognition, you might share what that was in the comments below. Not what you thought about it, what you noticed. And if someone in your life is carrying this particular kind of weight, this might be worth passing along. In the end, there is only this to see. Life was not waiting for you to let go before it began flowing. It has been flowing since before the mind learned the word for control. The uncertainty, the arrivals, the losses, the unexpected redirections, none of it was being held back by your grip, and none of it will be released by your surrender. It was moving. It is moving. It will continue moving with exactly the precision that causes water to move through clear stone, that causes seasons to know their sequence, that causes the breath to return without being summoned. The grip was not protecting anything real, and releasing it is not what restores the flow. What changes is only this, the seeing. When the mind stops spending itself on a control that was always imaginary, something becomes visible that was always present. The quiet underneath the vigilance, the steadiness that does not depend on outcomes, the particular stillness of a mind that has finally stopped arguing with what is already completely here. This is not a reward for practice. It is not the result of letting go. It is what was always true. And the only thing that ever obscured it was the belief that it needed to be managed into being.